Assalamualaikum and hi everyone. Let's learn about array. In this part, we are going to look into one-dimensional array. Why do we need array? Let's consider the following problem. How do we write Java program that read 5 numbers, find the sum, and prints the numbers in reverse order? Normally, we need to store all the numbers in 5 variables before we can print it in reverse order. Let's see the following code on the next slide. Before we learn about array, when we have several numbers to save, we would use several variables. Let's look at this code. Here we have a class called reverse order. We ask the user to enter 5 integers, and we save each value in separate variables called item 0, item 1, item 2, item 3, and also item 4. Then, we have another variable called sum, and it will save the addition value of item 0, item 1, item 2, item 3, and also item 4. In the code before, we used 5 variables to hold the data of each time the user input the number. 5 is doable, but what if we want to read 100 or more numbers? Does it make sense to declare 100 variables to hold all the data? We could use looping and reuse the variable, but we won't be able to print the value in reverse order because we keep on reassigning the value to the variable. So, this is where we could use an array. What is an array? An array is a structured data type with a fixed number of components. Every component is of the same type. We cannot mix the type. For example, from the previous problem, we want to save 100 values of type int, so we can have those as one array. If we have int, double, and string types, we can have a separate array for each of the different types. When we have an array, components, which are the different values, are accessed using their relative positions in the array. This means we can access the first value input, second value, until the last value. The values in an array are not replaced as they are different components within the array. This is different than when we reassign to a single variable. We will look at some examples to make sense of this. There are 3 types of array. The first one is one-dimensional array, two-dimensional array, and also multi-dimensional array. In one-dimensional array, you can think of it as having a table with one row and several columns, or if you want to think it the other way around, we can have one column with several rows. In two-dimensional array, we have rows and columns, or in graphs, we would have the x and y axis. In multi-dimensional array, you can imagine it as having, for example, if 3 dimensions, so in graph we have the x, y, and z axis. It can have more than 3-dimensional. We are going to learn only one-dimensional and two-dimensional array in this subject. Let's look at one-dimensional array first. To declare an array, there are 2 ways to do it. The first one is by writing the data type, square brackets, and then the array name equal to new data type, then in square brackets, the size of the array. Think of the size of the array as how many variables that you want to have. So, if as before, if we want to keep 5 values, then the size is 5. If we want to have 100 values, then the size is 100. Another way to write an array is by writing the data type, array name, then only the square brackets. Then similar as before, the equal sign and new data type and the size of the array. As to what we have learned before, when we use the new keyword, we are creating an object. So here, we are creating an object for our array of the data type. When we declare our array, we can choose to write the square brackets after the data type or after the array name. It all depends on your preference. As for the array name, it has the same rule as any identifier. For example, it cannot start with a number, and there are symbols that can be used. You can refer back to the topic where we covered about identifiers and the rules of it. Let's look at this simple example. Here we have int square brackets to mean that this is an array. Then we call our array as num. So there are two ways of doing it. We can have our square brackets after the data type, or we can have it after our array name, which is num. And then we have equal to new int 5, meaning that we are creating an object of our array type int, and it has the size of 5. Instead of writing it in one line, similar to variable, we can also write it within two lines, where when we write int square bracket num and then semicolon, that means that we are just declaring it. When we do num equal to new int 5, then that is only when we are creating our object of array. Let's try and understand the code. When we write int square bracket num equal to new int 5, what happens is we declare and create an array called num, and the size of it is 5. So this means we have 5 components, and each of them is type int. As I mentioned before, we can think of one-dimensional array as a table with one column and several rows, or if you want to think about it the other way around, one row with several columns. Since the size here is 5, that means we have 5 components, and each of the components can be accessed by their index number. The index will always start from 0 until the final number -1. So when the size is 5, the components are at index 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. We cannot access index 5 as it will give us an error. So even though when we say the size is 5, because we count from 0, so 0 up until 4 is still 5 components. The index number is used to access the component. The value for each of the array component is called an element. So we can say that at index 0, that is the first element. This can be a bit confusing as index 0 is element 1. All the data types in an array would have a default value. For example here, when we have int square bracket num, and then we have num equal to new int 5. So for int, the initial value is 0. So in this for loop, it will loop through the array num at index 0 up until index 4. And the output that we will get is 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, because we loop through it 5 times. If we have double square bracket num equal to new double 5, then the initial value of double is 0.0. You can try with char and string, where in char it will display 0, 0, 0, 0, and for string it will display null. Let's look at this example. Here we have array of 5 integers called test, and also array of 5 characters called grade. So we would create our array by writing int test square bracket equal to new int 5, say that we want the size of it to be 5, and also char grade square bracket equal to new char 5. We assign any values at any of our component by writing the array name, then within the square bracket is the index, then the equal sign, and then the value of it. For example, for test at index 0, we want to give it the value 85, so we would write it as test square bracket 0 equal to 85. Similarly, for char, we would do the same thing, where we need to know the index number and the value that it needs to have. So for char, the same as variables, we need to use the single quote. For string, we would use our double quotes. We do not need to assign all components to values if we do not need to, because as we saw before, array has the default value for int, double, char, string, and any data type. If we don't assign any value, they will have the default value. Assigning values into array. See that we have int square bracket list equal to new int and the size is 10. We can assign the value, for example, at index 3. So we can have list square bracket 3 equal to 10. So the component at index 3 would have the value 10. Similarly, we can have at other index, for example, list square bracket 6 equal to 35. We can do any calculation by referring to the values from other components. That is totally fine as well. For example, we can have list at index 5 equal to list at index 3 plus list at index 6. This is exactly the same as what we would do when we have different variables such as sum equal to num1 plus num2. The same concept, only that here we refer to the components in the same array by using the index number. When we do list 5 equal to list 3 plus list 6, that is doing 10 plus 35, which is 45. Then the value 45 is assigned to list 5. This figure here shows the elements in all of the components of the array. We declared and said that our array called list has the size of 10. So size 10 means the index number is from 0 until 9. In the previous slide, we only assigned values to index number 3, 5, and 6. So the other index number will have the value 0, which is the default value for type int. Specifying array size during program execution. So dynamic array is an array that is created during program execution. This allows the user to specify the size of the array instead of hard coding the size. For example, here we use scanner as usual to ask the user to enter the size of the array. Depending on the value, the array called list that is created will have the size that the user input. So in the size, we can write the variable within the square brackets. We have array size equal to input.nextInt, then int square bracket list equal to new int, and then within the square bracket the array size, which is the user's input. By having dynamic array, this is better than randomly fix the size, which might just be a waste of memory. Say that if we put the array size as 100, when we only want to have 10 components, not 100. Array initialization. Say that we have double square bracket sales equal to new double 5. If we don't assign any value to our array, it will have the default value depending on the data type. What we have seen before, we can access all index number and assign the value, but we have to do it one by one. For example, we have to do it as sales at index 0 equal to 12.25, and then sales at index 1, 32.50, and so on. So, instead of doing it one by one, we can assign the value into the array during declaration straight away. The values are called initial values. They are placed within braces and separated by commas. We do not need to write the size of the array, but instead, it will find out the size based on the number of initial values that we write within the braces. If the array is declared and initialized simultaneously, we do not use the new operator to create the array object. Even if we initialize it within the braces, to access each of the value, we need to refer them by their index number. The only difference here is in the way that we initialize it. So these two ways are valid. Either initialize it during declaration or you initialize it later on. Can we declare and initialize our array this way? If we want to use braces, we cannot declare our array and then initialize it later on. It will give us an error. So if you want to initialize the values later, we could do double square bracket sales, semicolon, and then on the next line, sales equal to new double, and then the size of it. Say that we declare and initialize our array using the braces. How do we know the length of the array? A public instance variable length is associated with each array that has been instantiated. The variable length contains the size of the array. The variable length can be directly accessed in a program using the array name and the dot operator. For example, if we have int square bracket list equal to braces 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and also 60. This statement creates the array list of 6 components, which is for index 0 until 5, and then initialize the components using the values given within the braces. Here, if we do system.out.println list.length, it will display 6, which is the size of this array. The variable length here is useful. Say that we have many values when we initialize the array, and we are not sure the size of it. Can you think of a situation where we need to use length? For example, we have this array called number, and we initialize some values. It makes no sense to count it by hand, so we can use number.length to find out the size of this array. When we run this code, it will display 27 as the number.length. We can also use it to do some kind of calculation at certain index number or certain value. As we do not know the size of it, in our for loop, we can use number.length instead of the exact number, so it will check all the components in the array. For example, here is the code to count how many number 1 do we have in this array. What happened here is, it will go through all the components from index 0 until the last index and increment by 1 each time. If number at index I is equal to 1, what it does here is it checks the value of number at index 0 is it equal to 1. If it is, it will increment the value of count. Then increase the index number, so the index number I becomes 1. It keeps on looping until I value becomes 27, and then it will exit the for loop. If you run this code, the output that you will get is it will display there are 3 number 1 within the array because it has checked all the components within this array. We can also do something like this, where we give the value of number.length to a variable, array size, and then refer to it within our for loop. Or we can also write the number straight away. This is hard coding it within our program. We normally try to avoid hard coding our code because, for example here, say that we add another value to our array, then we have to change the length, which is 27 to 28. If we use number.length, we do not need to change it. Let's look at more examples of array. So we can use loops to process array in several ways, such as initializing an array to a specific value, input data into an array, printing an array, find the sum and average of an array, and we can also use it to determine the largest element in an array. These are just some examples where you can use loops and arrays. It can be within anything. Here is showing how to initialize an array to a specific value. For example, we have an array called sales that is type double. The size of it is 10. So we write double square bracket sales equal to new double 10. Since we want all components to have the value 10, instead of doing sales at index 0 equal to 10, sales at index 1 equal to 10, up until sales at index 9 equal to 10, we can use for loop to do it. In this example here, we use sales.length, meaning that it will loop through all components until the end of the array. We have sales in square bracket index, where this index number will start with 0, then 1, and so on, because within our for loop, we increment the index number. We can also use array within our for loop to prompt the user to enter the value for each component. So it will loop through at each index. And we can also use it to display the values in the array or the elements of the arrays as what we have seen before. We can do any kind of calculation, for example, finding the sum and average of the array. In this example, we have the array called sales and the size of it is 10. So in the for loop, it will go through index 0 until index 9. At each round, it will add the value of the element. See here that we did not assign any value to our array, so D will have the value 0. Then we have if sales.length not equal to 0, this is true because the size of our array is 10. So it will calculate the average by dividing the value of the sum and the sales.length, which is 10. Other kind of thing that we can do is perhaps finding the largest element in the array. We can use max.max to simplify this, but say that we want to check it one by one. So within the if, it will check the element or value within the first index and compare it with the second index. Whichever that is larger, it will update the index number to max index. It keeps on checking until the end of the array. It will access that element using sales in square bracket max index from before. This code here can be explained much easier when we have numbers. Say that we assign the value 9 to sales 0, at sales at index 1 is 30, sales at index 2 is 10, and sales at index 3 is 70. The rest of the elements are 0. We set the max index equal to 0, so we basically say that sales at index 0 is currently the largest element. As we have set index 0 as the largest, we'll compare it with the next one, which is with element at index 1. That's why we start off with index equal to 1. You can still start off with your index equal to 0. However, that will compare the value with itself. At if sales in square bracket max index less than sales in square bracket index, we are comparing the elements. So we are comparing sales at index 0 less than sales at index 1, which is 9 less than 30. This is true, so we change the max index from 0 to 1. It will then repeat the same process until it reaches sales.length, the maximum number of it. This figure here shows example of values in the sales array and how it compares the elements to find the largest element in the array. The example that I showed you before are just a simplified version of it with simpler numbers. Array index out of bounds happen when we try to access the index number that is outside of the array. It can be the value larger than or equal to the array size or any value less than 0. If it gets array index out of bounds exception, the program will terminate. Let's look at this example. We have double square bracket num equal to new double and the size of it is 10. So the index number is from 0 until 9. If we try to access at index 10 or at index -1, it will give us an error saying that we have array index out of bounds. Here is showing another example as a table of several rows and one column, where we have an array called list and the size of it is 10, meaning that the index is from 0 until 9. So if we try to access list at index 10, we can't because list at index 10 does not exist. It will see that the array index is out of bound. We have seen examples of array using int and double. Here is showing the string data type. The way to create it is the same as before, but for string, as we have learned in previous topic, string is an object. Int, double, and char are primitive data types. What it meant by that is for number or int and double, the values itself are kept in the memory. For string, in the memory, it will keep the address of it, and using the address, we will get to the value. To summarize, we have looked at how to declare and create an array. There are two ways where we can have the square brackets after the data type or after the array name. We can also initialize the values when we declare it by using the braces. So when we use braces, we do not need to state the size of the array. When we write int square bracket myArray equal to new int and the size of it is 5, it starts from index number 0 until 4, so that there are still 5 values for the array. We cannot access myArray at index 5 as it will give us an array index out of bound exception. To access any value in our array, we need to state which index number. Remember that for index 0, we would refer it as the first element of the array. We have also looked at the instance variable called length to get the size of the array. So that's all for the first part of array. In the next part, we are going to look into the two-dimensional array.